On this episode of ADE Spotlight Podcast, I had the pleasure to speak with Amy Hostinsky, who is the lead clinician for OnSite here in Michigan. We've been partners with OnSite for a number of years, so I was excited to have this opportunity to speak to Amy, where I thought we could look at issues related to the relationship between substance abuse providers and the criminal justice system. Amy had a lot of very interesting things to say. I think you're going to enjoy listening to this as much as I enjoyed participating in it. Amy, I want to thank you for being with us today. This series of podcasts is something that we've been doing for maybe close to 18 months now. We've had a lot of fun with it. We've learned a lot. We've talked to folks about a number of issues ranging from opiates and marijuana to acupuncture and breast cancer and natural medicine and fetal alcohol syndrome. So this is just another opportunity to talk with somebody who knows a little bit more than we do about certain topics. So today I thought we could talk a little bit about your work with OnSite and your work with specifically court-ordered clients. Although we can branch out from there, I am interested in the relationship between the court system and folks who need substance abuse treatment and or mental health treatment.
It's a very interesting dynamic for sure.
I have in my office here, I have a bumper sticker. I don't quite recall where I picked it up, but I put it up on a bulletin board that I have in my office, and it says "Drug Courts Work." And, you know, that sentiment, I think, is a noble one. And as I see drug courts in action, DUI courts or drug courts or veterans court or any of these sort of specialty courts or accountability courts, it does bring to mind that relationship between the court system, where there is a public safety interest, versus the individual's need for rehabilitation and substance use treatment, all that kind of stuff. So that's kind of the overall view of what I'd like to talk to you about today. But can you just start with, tell us a little bit about yourself, tell us a little bit about your experience, what it is that you do, how long you've been doing it, all that kind of stuff.
Sure. So I started in the field in 2008. I started an internship at an inpatient drug rehabilitation place. So I started there, and I just loved it. It was awesome to be able to work with people who were, in that setting, were motivated to receive help. They wanted to make some changes to their lifestyle. So I started there, and then my second job after I finished my bachelor's degree was also at an inpatient facility, but it was in a more upper class area. So it was interesting to see the change in dynamics between people coming to rehab with no money and then people also coming in with funds and having more resources available. And just after that is when I started OnSite in 2012.
Tell us a little bit about OnSite. Now, just so for the folks who are listening, you are in the state of Michigan. Tell us a little bit about what OnSite does.
So OnSite is a drug testing facility as well as a counseling facility. That's one of the things that makes us really unique. We have OnSite substance abuse testing and New Frontier Counseling Services. So I work as far as the lead clinician as New Frontier Counseling Services. And the nice part is we get to work together. So if I have clients who come in from the court for drug testing, I have an opportunity to monitor their drug testing results in real time as I'm doing their counseling services. As far as the counseling services go, we do so many different things. We do evaluations that range from the substance abuse evaluation, mental health evaluations, evaluations for Department of Transportation for people who may have experienced licensing issues due to having positive drug screens. We do anger management classes, domestic violence classes, cognitive behavioral education, retail fraud classes, handgun prevention classes, which has been an interesting learning experience for me. We also do substance abuse treatment, mental health treatment, couples counseling, a whole range of things.
But it seems like a lot to keep straight, Amy.
It can be. I definitely have a lot of curriculum and basic ideas, and I love the diversity of it.
And it is through your work in OnSite that you became familiar with ADE, and that's sort of the connection we have here between you and I. You work with our friend Terry Brown. Those of you who have listened to previous podcasts may recall the conversation that we had with Terry. That was pretty interesting.
Oh, I say Terry's great. I love working for him. He always has so many great new ideas.
Yeah, we really enjoy being a partner with him. I want to go back to your first job, which coincidentally was the same as mine, and that is in an inpatient facility. Now, mine preceded yours by a couple of decades, but in the mid 1980s to the mid 1990s, when I was involved in inpatient treatment, we had a sort of a standard length of stay that was 28 days, and people came. Now, this is an oversimplification, but they came and they stayed for 28 days, almost whether they needed it or not. It was sort of a standard 4-week treatment, which was great. I enjoyed every minute of it, but very expensive. And there was, at that time, sort of beginning to be a movement to justify lengths of stay. And I would imagine by the time you got involved 20 years later, the length of stay was considerably shorter than 28 days. Is that correct?
At my first job, which was in Detroit, we had more access to block grants and like SEMCA and stuff. So there was a little bit more openness, but most clients were about the 28-day stay. But my second my second job, which was about 2 years later, was 14 days, and it was a fight to get 14 days at that point. Yeah.
But I completely support what you say. It was a great experience for me, and this is probably true for you. But all these years later, a lot of the lessons I learned working in that inpatient program still hold true today. I find myself referring back to those days quite a bit.
Definitely.
But even back then, there was this idea of motivating clients to get involved in treatment, and this idea that you sort of had to raise the bottom for them, or this idea that people didn't come into treatment on their own. I had this is not a phrase that I coined, but it's one that I borrowed. I still use it frequently now. And somebody said back in those days that nobody comes to treatment on their own. It's one of the 4 L's. It's my liver, my lover, my livelihood, or the law. One or more of those is exerting pressure on me to come into treatment. And you keep that. If we keep that pressure on, eventually people may become self-motivated and continue on from there. So it's always been interesting to me, the dynamic between those external forces, specifically the court system, that putting enough pressure and motivation on an individual until they're motivated themselves. I don't know that that's always a fair statement, but it seems to encapsulate the idea. In
general, I would say yes. Mm-hmm.
Yeah. Now, is it true that then the majority of your clients are referred by the court system?
Yes, that is correct.
And you have, I would imagine, a number of courts feeding clients to you.
Yeah, we have some courts that we work with. We have more clients than others, but I have worked with courts all over the state because sometimes people from around here say they go up to Lansing for a weekend at Michigan State, and then they live over here, so they get referred for services at our agency.
How is that? How is that relationship between you and the court personnel handled? How does that work?
Typically, we communicate a lot through phone call or email or fax. The court has certain expectations from us and it's important to us to follow those expectations for the clients because us communicating with the court allows better outcomes for the clients. The court knows that the client is following through, that they're working on obtaining benefits from treatment. Also, the courts will let us know if they have any concerns about the client. With testing, let's say the client doesn't test at our agency but tests somewhere else, we're aware of what's going on there.
A client is convicted of some alcohol or drug related offense as part of their sanctions. They need to be evaluated, or they may be required to submit to alcohol and or drug testing, or perhaps if it's a domestic violence, they may have to go to couples counseling or anger management. That's typically how they come to you?
Yes, they were charged. They go through the court process, from arraignment, pre-sentencing, all of that. They get charged, and usually many of the court, like I said, court sanctions will be drug and alcohol testing, but also some type of either education or a treatment program, a standard outpatient treatment.
When you say standard outpatient treatment, for somebody who isn't at all familiar with this world, what does that mean?
So what I tell clients is if you are ordered to do outpatient treatment, standard length is about 12 sessions, 3 months or so, depending on if you're attending every week, which is preferred. It could go longer. I've had in fact, with sobriety court, I've had clients that have seen me for 2 years, and seeing me 2 years from once a week, maybe every other week. But ultimately, if you are ordered to do outpatient treatment at a court, it is my experience that about 12 weeks is your base level.
Is that individual counseling or group counseling, Amy?
It can be either or. Sometimes individual, sometimes group, sometimes both. It just depends on what's best for the client. Some people do better in groups because they get to see the experiences of others. And I find, especially with my groups for the clients I have on probation, it's really enjoyable because the clients feel a little less isolated. They see that they're not the only ones going through these court sanctions, having to do testing. Having a community service is a big requirement that a lot of people have, so it gives them a chance to find out where to go, what works best, and also just the peer pressure. That's been a group that's been coming up lately in a lot of my groups. How do you deal with not being able to drink with your friends when you have a court order telling you can't, and maybe your friends don't always understand that?
Is it your responsibility to make that decision as to whether they need individual or group? Does the court sort of leave that open to you?
Yes, it's usually left open to me.
Do you find that the courts are generally receptive to your recommendations?
Yes, I have never really had a problem with a court accepting my recommendation, and there's always things to back up my recommendation. So when a client comes in, they get what's called an intake assessment or a biopsychosocial, and then that's where we get to know the client, all the different aspects of their life, and based on that, we have a better idea of where to fit them.
When you do that initial evaluation, I'm just imagining that the client's coming to you from the court and they're not really sure what's going to happen. So I would imagine that they come in the door with some, maybe sometimes some anger about having to do this in the first place, or some paranoia about what's going to happen if I tell you the truth about my drug and alcohol use or other things. Is that fair? Is that your experience?
Yes, very much so. So typically I see a few different things. Definitely a guardedness. They feel afraid that if they're truly honest with me, I'm going to go back to the court and say, oh, they've told me all of these things that they're doing. Although a lot of times courts will do what's called a pre-sentence investigation. So a lot of the history that they tell me they've already given to the court. But if they maybe misrepresented some of the truth, they may be tempted to do the same with me. So one of the first things we do is we go over an informed consent to treatment. So the idea with that is just there are limitations to what I can report to the court. I cannot necessarily go to the court and say, this client told me he's drank every day for the past 2 years. That's not something I can necessarily say. I might say to the court, all I will say is that the client's participating. So all we can typically report to the court is like attendance, if they stopped attending, and then general cooperation, because confidentiality is a very important thing and a very important part of this process. The client has to know that things will be kept confidential, and we are ultimately looking out for the best interest of them as far as the counseling goes, so they can get the most out of the process.
Confidentiality, you mentioned. There are, maybe you can talk a little bit about that, how clients are protected by federal law when it comes to confidentiality. I think many people are familiar with HIPAA guidelines, but they would be less familiar with some of the other guidelines specific to substance use. Can you speak on that?
I sure can. So yeah, there's definitely a whole other side. So you have HIPAA, like we talked about, but then there's also confidentiality regulations put out for specifically substance abuse and mental health services. So if people are interested, if you look up 42 CFR Part 2, that is very specific to the rules and regulations of things that we can go over to, or we can give to the court system.
Now, the fact that the individual is involved in the court system, though, is their confidentiality any different than somebody who would voluntarily come to you without having gone through the court system?
The biggest difference would just be that the court does have an expectation of some kind of update, typically once a month. While it is general, like I said, just attendance, cooperation level, that is something if a client came in on their own, I wouldn't necessarily have to be updating anybody. They would be going through their treatment. Here, with the court system, the courts need to know that the client is attending and participating.
Is the client required to give authorization for you to do that?
No, the client is not required to. There is a confidentiality release that they sign that goes into exactly what will be disclosed to the court. It does outline some of the CFR rules, but they are always right to not sign that, and then I cannot update the court on anything. Though for the clients, they don't typically not sign it because they also want the courts to know that they're doing what they're supposed to. They want to get through probation.
Right. But even for court-mandated clients, they have to give you authorization to release that information.
Correct.
Now, failing to do so probably is not in their best interest, but and as you say, they probably don't do that, but they still are have to sign a release of information for you to be able to do that.
Mm-hmm. Yes.
Does that, when you explain that process, do you think that's well understood by your clients? Does it help with the fear of disclosure?
It helps immensely. A lot of times when clients first come in, before we, like the first 2 minutes where we haven't even gotten into that, you can tell they're very guarded, walls up, not sure what to expect. And then once we start going into all of that, they would say, oh, okay, that's good to know, or they'll be much more open after we have that conversation.
Yeah. Are there any exceptions to that? In other words, in a scenario where you may be counseling somebody where you feel that they're at risk or somebody else may be at risk? How do you handle that?
Oh, I'm glad that you asked. So one of the, I don't say speeches I give, but one of the things I explain to the clients is that while there's confidentiality, there is a limit. If you threaten to hurt yourself, if you threaten to hurt someone else, if we feel that you're in a medical crisis situation and we have to let an ambulance person know what's going on, those are all limits to confidentiality. That's definitely a big thing. If we have any concern that you can hurt yourself or somebody else, we need to protect you, the other person, so we will have to make a report.
Yeah. So these folks that find themselves involved in the court system for some drug or alcohol related offense, that's I think that the number that gets thrown out, if you, for example, are arrested for DUI, the total cost of a DUI they say is about $10,000. I think that factors in a lot of different things, but that's a lot of money. And I would imagine there's similar financial burden associated with other drug and alcohol related offenses as well. And yet people who are in that situation may find themselves being told that they have to go to treatment as well. How is that handled? What are some of the financial obstacles for the folks that are ordered to come see you, and how do you deal with those financial obstacles for them so you can kind of clear the path for them to get the help they need?
That is definitely one of the biggest obstacles to treatment. Court ordered is especially hard because a lot of times insurance companies are not going to pay for court ordered. They're kind of, this is something that you did, you have to take care of it. As far as New Frontier and OnSite go, we do try and offer very low pricing. We're typically right around $45 a session, which is pretty unheard of. A lot of times agencies are more, and it's understandable why they are more because it's a service and you're paying for professional, but we do try and keep the cost low as one of the barriers, to prevent one of the barriers. We try and offer, for example, I don't want to say like a payment plan, but you can usually start the process and then work up into your sessions. There's also other programming. We might try and talk with the client if they do have insurance and suggest different places. We are also in the process of becoming paneled by insurances. Right now we do accept Medicaid, but we're working on accepting many other insurances. So hopefully that will be something that we can help with. And definitely with the specialty courts like sobriety court, mental health court, because there's an underlying issue there, it's a lot easier to get coverage because you do have a substance abuse problem. You're not just coming in because someone told you to. You do need help. You do need services.
What are some of the other obstacles people have to getting to you?
The other obstacle I see a lot is transportation. So if you get especially a DUI or even repeated drug offenses, like say a second possession of marijuana case, your license can get affected. There's different ways. It can be suspended completely for a year. It can be restricted for the first, say, 6 months or 30 days. So people, if they don't have a license at all, trying to get to one of the locations, if when you think about finances, if you're paying all your court fines and you don't have the best vehicle and your vehicle breaks down, so yeah, definitely finances and transportation are the key things. We do try and operate pretty close to bus lines as much as we can. We will help clients find bus tickets or lower costs for the bus if need be, but that's definitely a big obstacle.
One of the things that I'm curious about when we're working with court-ordered clients is there's almost what we could kind of perceive as conflicting interests. In other words, the court and all the court officers and probation departments and so on. First of all, I would imagine you would agree with this statement. I know we work with many probation departments, and I don't have a really bad word to say about any of them. All the people that I know that work as probation officers have large caseloads. They work very, very hard, and have the best interests of everybody involved.
I completely agree. Yes.
But I think inherent, maybe I'm wrong too, and you'll tell me if I'm wrong. But sort of inherently, there's a different interest there in that the interest of the court in general is overall public safety. So if somebody is engaged in criminal behavior, DUI, drug-related behavior, that's putting themselves or other people at risk, it's a duty of the court to intervene and make sure that behavior stops. So there's the public safety interest versus, somebody who's doing the clinical work, whose interest is in treating that individual who may have a chronic relapsing disease. And so it may be that the interests are sort of conflicting there on some level. Does that make sense? And how is that worked out?
I know what you mean, because as a lot of people talk about addiction, part of addiction is relapsing. That a lot of people don't just stop and stay stopped. There might be a relapse or a slip. And with the courts, if there is a violation, where a violation being that a client tests positive for drugs or alcohol, then they would handle it differently than I would as a clinician. So as a clinician, we would work through what happened, triggers, what was it that led to that slip, how do we get away from those triggers, how do we make things better. The courts may have to put out a violation. There might be some form of a consequence kind of put out there. In my experience with the courts, so they want to see the clients sober just the way that I do. So they try and do as much as they can. So sometimes with violations, it may be keep going to counseling or maybe increase your counseling. It might be, it's usually not something long-term that would inhibit them from being able to complete their counseling or things that would actually help their sobriety, in my experience.
When I talk to groups of people who are not as well versed in all of this as people that work in the field are, and I talk about treatment, I often use the analogy of a ladder. And there's different rungs on the ladder, and people who are, people that come to you, you will assess them. You do your evaluation, you do your interview, you do all of that. The biopsychosocial social evaluation, as you described, is kind of just an overall history, and you decide what rung on that ladder they start. And they'll this is an oversimplification, but they will either be successful on that rung or they won't. And if they are, then maybe they can graduate to a lower rung. But if they're not successful on this rung, perhaps they need to move to a higher rung. And so in a scenario where you have somebody who has been court ordered to see you, and you do your evaluation and you decide on a course of treatment, and that course of treatment involves drug screens, and they have a failed drug screen, and I would imagine that it's your duty to report that to the court. Do you generally find that the court will sort of leave it to you to decide what should happen there in terms of, do they need more treatment? Do they need a different level of treatment, rather than punishing them for violating probation? Or is it some combination of both?
Typically some combination of both. Usually it is up to me to decide if there needs to be an increase, how much of an increase. I can, they allow me to look for resources to help clients, perhaps more support group meetings in addition to the treatment, things like that. There may be some court penalties that come along with it. Every court is different with those penalties. So there are those, and sometimes those serve as a motivator for the client. Many of my clients, especially at first, the fear of going to jail is a big motivator. So sometimes, and not that jail is an automatic guarantee if you test positive. I think the court tries to use different consequences as a way to motivate individuals to continue their program. Sometimes we need those outside influences to help us keep doing what we need to do.
Yeah. All of the data that we have on our assessment instruments, all of it, is very clear. The number one drug of choice is always alcohol. Number two is always marijuana. And then there's lower numbers going on from there. But generally, those folks that complete the needs assessment or one of our other assessments identify it in that order. But one of the things that we are, we can't really get away from, it's in the news all the time, is the increased attention anyway, increased focus certainly on opioids. I saw it, I don't know if you saw the news story the other day. I was watching the news and they had a sort of a breaking news about the surprising news about Tom Petty's death. His autopsy results came out and he died of an accidental overdose. And I thought to myself, well, it wasn't really very surprising at all. We've seen the impact that opioids is having, not only on folks like Tom Petty, but on folks that live in our neighborhoods and work where we work and family and all that. My family is not alone. My family knows people who have been touched by this. Are you seeing an increase in clients coming to you that are using opioids or have had issues with opioids?
We are seeing an increase, though we do primarily work with clients who have alcohol or marijuana offenses, while the clients who have issues with opiates tend to get a higher level of care, typically inpatient first and foremost, because you need to break out of that system that you're in, your circle around you. So inpatient tends to be where many clients that are addicted to heroin go first.
Well, that makes perfect sense. When you talk about certainly the need for some kind of medically managed intervention certainly to get through any kind of initial withdrawal from that anyway. But it seems to be quite an area of attention. When I was, I flash back to when I was working in inpatient back in the late 1980s. We created a specific treatment track. So even within our inpatient program, we created a specific treatment track for treating what we were seeing as the quote epidemic unquote of the time, which was crack cocaine. So this was in the late 1980s, and that I don't want to get into that right now, but there were pros and cons of doing that kind of thing within our treatment program. There are definite pros and there were definite cons. Flash forward to about, let's say, 7 or 8 years ago. Now I happen to travel around the country quite a bit to speak, and I was somewhere in a hotel, and I got the USA Today paper, and one of the articles on the front page of the USA Today, it struck me. It was about the need for more money and more treatment for what was the quote epidemic unquote at that time, which was methamphetamine. And now we're having the same conversations about opioids. And some of the efforts with treatment. I know there's a legislative effort here in Michigan to limit certain opioid prescriptions to 7 days versus 30 days. And so there's a legislative effort in intervention. The state of Michigan has created a database for prescription drugs that didn't exist before. So there's those kinds of interventions. But it sometimes strikes me that the more things change, the more they stay the same. And I don't want to be so cavalier as to say, a drug is a drug is a drug and addiction is addiction. But there is some truth to that, isn't there, Amy?
I think there's definitely things when I think about like helping with addiction or how to go into recovery from addiction, no matter what it is, whether it's alcohol or crack cocaine or methamphetamine or anything, there's definitely certain things that we want to help with that will help the client move towards recovery or maintain their recovery, whether that be support group meetings, changing your routine, developing a whole new routine, avoiding triggers, changing your thought processes. There's just so many things, and that tends to, I see, go along all different types of addiction. And even when you step out of drugs and alcohol and go into other types of addiction or habits that aren't healthy for us, a lot of it can be used all across the board.
Yeah, to treat that compulsion, that compulsive behavior. Yeah, yeah. That's sort of the age-old question. Is addiction a genetic disease, or is it something else? And we had a lengthy conversation here in the office not too long ago about the difference between addiction and dependence. I may be dependent if I'm a diabetic, for example. I may be dependent on insulin, but that doesn't necessarily mean that I'm addicted to insulin. That there is a difference there, that I think that we were having a conversation at that time about the change from the DSM-4 in 2013 to the DSM-5 and how the language changed. How in the DSM-4 you could diagnose somebody with substance abuse or substance dependence. And then that language changed to now the DSM-5. Folks are diagnosed with a substance use disorder, with varying severities.
That change is interesting. I know it's very controversial, but it does allow, I've noticed in my diagnosing, a little bit more freedom. Because maybe someone fell in between abuse and dependence. They were having the issues. Now with substance use disorder and the severity levels, I can pinpoint their symptoms and what they're actually having problems with, I find much more accurately.
Yeah, I like it too. I like that sort of sliding scale feature of it, where you can have a disorder of varying severities. Anyway, I think we're getting a little technical there, but just helping folks understand. Those of us that work, I guess it's true in any field that you're in. Every field has its own language. And if you dropped us into a room full of mechanical engineers, they would speak in a language, and using whatever terminology or acronyms they use that we wouldn't understand. And so you take somebody who, with very little understanding of what substance use disorders are, finds themselves standing in front of a judge who says, okay, based on this information here's what you have to do. You have to go see Amy over at OnSite, and she's going to do all these things. It's got to be an intimidating process, because as I mentioned, I was sitting in a courtroom not too long ago. It happens very fast. You stand up in front of that judge and they say boom, 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 and then literally the gavel is knocked down, and you have to figure out what does all that mean. It's got to be a little bit intimidating. And so and then I go over and I see Amy, and Amy starts talking to me about all this sort of thing. And I think sometimes we need to remind ourselves that people that don't work in this field have a hard time grasping the concept of what a substance use disorder might be or what recovery might entail.
Yeah, it's very important to me with my clients, because many of my clients tell me that they almost go into it. I'm trying to think how to describe it, even like a tunnel vision, where they're like, I know the judge was talking to me and he was telling me things, but I didn't fully get everything that they were saying. I'm confused. I don't know what all this means. So it's really important to me when they come in to sit down. And first and foremost, I always want people to know, like, this is judgment-free. We are here to listen to you. We are here to help you. For a lot of clients, I think, get a little worried because, and I don't want to say the court is about judging, but it's very like, this is what it is. This is your charge. Here's what you have to do. So this is the first place a lot of times the clients get a chance to come and talk and explain how they're feeling about what they've been through, what's going on, what to expect. So I always want them to know that I will not be judging them in any capacity, that we're just here to help them fulfill some of their requirements, and if we can help improve their life or help them accomplish some goals that they've been wanting to, that this is the place to do it. And then we go into explaining what the process is, what the intake will be, what information will be sent to the court. We'll be developing a treatment plan. So that's one of my favorite things because it gives the clients a chance to sit down and talk about their goals, their objectives, what some of their problems may be. And like I like to tell clients, it's all encompassing. So it isn't just, I think a lot of clients think, oh, we're just going to come here and talk about marijuana. Yeah. Well, no, what's some other things in your life going on that could be influencing your marijuana use or could make it tricky to stop smoking marijuana, even though part of you wants to because the court has said you need to stop. So just explaining it step by step in simple terms every part of the way so that they're aware of what's going on, what they're getting into, and how it can be helpful for them.
That must be very comforting for them once they finally get to sit down with you and you take a breath and have it explained to them in that way. The court system, it is very matter of fact. This is what's going to happen. Here's what you have to do, and they move on. What about while you were talking, I was thinking, what about somebody who maybe English isn't their first language? How difficult must that be to navigate through that? Do you have?
Oh, it's very difficult.
Yeah. Do you find
we usually have an interpreter?
Yeah. I would imagine that would just make it infinitely much harder to understand what's happening. Or folks who are or maybe that can't read or write or comprehend very well all of this information they're being given at the court.
Mm-hmm. And so a lot of times we do have that. I've had interpreters come in and sit with clients so that we can go through things together and help explain it. Even with an interpreter, sometimes it's hard. Or I've had clients who were deaf, so kind of like working through reading lips, writing things down. Clients who cannot read and write, and just kind of explaining at whatever level they need to have it explained to them, whatever makes the most sense. So it's always adapting, always trying to explain in a way that makes the most sense to the client and makes it the easiest for the client to engage in.
I realize that I'm sort of bouncing all over the place, but when we were talking about substance use disorder and diagnosing and all that kind of thing, it occurred to me, though, not everyone who comes to you is going to be diagnosed with a substance use disorder. Just because I had a DUI offense or a drug offense doesn't necessarily mean that I meet the criteria for a substance use disorder. Is that a fair statement?
On the most basic level, because you had a legal issue, it's a little bit easier to diagnose towards a substance use disorder, even on a mild level, because now your substance use has led to some type of inappropriate behavior. But you're right, you're completely correct that sometimes if it's their first one, and we don't always get DUI, sometimes we get someone who's being a little bit rowdy in public, and not that that's great, and not that that's what you want to do, but it's different than operating a vehicle. And sometimes it's all about what led to that. So why were you drinking so much that you got to the point of intoxication of being loud or being different than you would normally be? And sometimes that could be a mental health disorder. It could be family stressors. It could be any number of things.
Yeah. But is the goal always total abstinence?
For court ordered, that would be the goal, just because they're testing. So that is definitely one of the goals, is to make sure that they can stay abstinent through probation. And one of the things I talk to clients about, because clients do struggle with that idea sometimes, is that sobriety is an okay thing to be. It's a good thing to be. Even if you weren't court ordered, it's not always a bad thing to not do any mind-altering substances. You can be more clear-headed. You can make different decisions. You can change your social circle. That's a big thing that a lot of clients struggle with, is all my friends go and drink or all my friends smoke. Well, how about bringing new people into your social circle that don't drink or don't smoke?
Yeah.
So I think abstinence is definitely something I really like to encourage.
Amy, if you had a magic wand, what thing or things would you improve about the relationship between the courts and substance abuse treatment providers?
Gosh, what I think would make it the most easiest would be money. If there was more free programming out there or more grants for people to get access to court-ordered substance abuse treatment services, I think that would help immensely. It would help the clients. It would make them more able to cooperate. I have a lot of clients that will tell me, oh, I love this so much, I just wish it was free, because this would be something I could do for years, or things like that. And also transportation. So like those two barriers that sometimes aren't really thought about, or aren't really, I think sometimes clients feel like aren't cared about. If we can somehow stop those barriers from happening, that would make a huge difference for people, because that would take away a level of stress that they're going through too.
I was talking to a guy not too long ago. He's on the city council of a local city by where I live, and they are debating issues related to legal marijuana. There's a lot of issues around, like granting licenses for distribution and growing and all of that. So we were sort of talking about the nuts and bolts of that kind of legislation. But one of the things that he said, one of the arguments for legalization of marijuana, is that the monies raised could be used to do just the things you're talking about, which would remain to be seen. That would remain to, yeah. I think now, of course, you and I are both in the state of Michigan. I think that sooner rather than later, the state of Michigan is going to make a decision about legal recreational marijuana. I know there's efforts to put it on the ballot. I know there were efforts in 2016. I'm sure there's going to be efforts here in 2018. I think sooner rather than later, the state of Michigan will be asked to make a decision about that. Along with.
Probably.
Go ahead.
Oh, I say probably this year. It seems. I think it will be on the ballot this year, so it's going to be interesting to see how the voting goes for it.
Well, I think the polling, indicates that the majority of people are for it, but it still remains to be seen. But if in fact it were to happen, if some of that money raised went to addressing some of the things that you're seeing as obstacles, more money for people to access treatment, I think that would be a nice consequence of that kind of decision.
I would appreciate that. The more we can do to help that, I think the more benefit we can have to clients.
Amy, I'm sure I've kept you long enough. I've really enjoyed this conversation. Can you, how about you leave us with a success story? Do you have one that comes to mind?
I really enjoy my work I do with sobriety courts. So different cities have different types of sobriety court, and usually what it is, it's a very multidisciplinary or interdisciplinary process where judges and probation officers and therapists and drug testing agencies and support group meetings, and they're all kind of working together. So those are some of my favorite stories, where you see a client start at the beginning of the process, and they're scared and they're overwhelmed, and they have all of these requirements, and they don't know what to expect, and they're not sure how they're going to do it all. And then you just see the progress through, where 6 months down the line, they've been in treatment and they've been sober for 6 months, and they're feeling great, and they're continuously working their program, and then 9 months, and they're still making those gains. And there might be a slip, but then everybody's working together, including the client, to get back on track and keep it going, and then they get to graduate. And I've been to some sobriety court graduations, and it's just such a wonderful feeling. You take all of this hard work that the client has done, and it's hard work, and they get to say that they did it. They remained sober for 2 years, and usually it's this change and that change and all these wonderful things they've added to their lives. And you see the proud look on the judge's face and the probation officer's face and the client's face, and that's one of my favorite parts of the job.
I imagine it is. I know some probation officers. I know some sobriety court judges, and they echo exactly what you said. That graduation day is a proud moment for everybody, and especially the client. So it's great. I think that's a good way to sort of bring this full circle. The relationship between the court and the treatment providers, maybe they have at times conflicting interest, and maybe sometimes the courts may seem a little bit matter of fact toward the client, maybe not as empathetic as the client might hope they might be. But at the end of the day, you talk about those kinds of stories. That marriage works, and what's great, you get somebody involved in something like a sobriety court where there's a lot of different stakeholders involved, and you have this individual for a length of time, enough time to make a difference. It's great. It's great, and so if I could say sometimes it's a shaky marriage, it certainly is a good one. Amy, I just want to tell you, I really, really appreciate your time. This was great, and perhaps sometime we can do it again.
I sure hope so. Thank you. It was really wonderful to be able to talk about this process and how people know that it is a safe and judgment-free zone, and that we want this to be a good experience for them.
Thanks for listening to this episode of the ADE Spotlight podcast. If you would like to be a guest on one of our podcasts, or if you have an idea for a topic you'd like us to cover, please feel free to drop us a line. We'd love to hear your suggestions. If you haven't done so already, I encourage you to check out ADE Solutions, a new website from ADE. There you will find a variety of quizzes and assessments covering a whole range of behavioral health related topics, including substance use, gambling, mental health disorders, eating disorders, and the like. If you have concerns about yourself or a loved one in these areas, please access the website and check out the assessments. Or if you simply want to expand your knowledge on these topics, on the education tab on that website, we have a variety of quizzes as well as other podcasts similar to the one that you just listened to. You can find that at www.ade.solutions, or you can link to it from our corporate website, www.adeincorp.com.